And one of the things I put up earlier was really about convergent and, well, I didn't put the word divergent, but in terms of responses that participants make in any sort of online environment, we often either get a convergent or a divergent response. That is, if it's a convergent one, we're expecting everyone to give the same response. If it's divergent, then we can get different ones. And I just wonder what your thoughts are with games about whether, I know games are quite well designed for the convergent response, where we're expecting everyone to give the same sort of, or the correct response, as we might say, like the example you showed with the triage, and that there'd be a preferred way of responding in those situations. What about games for divergent responses, where we actually would be quite happy for participants to have different responses, and those different responses might lead to branching and go down different paths? So what are your thoughts about that in terms of game design?
So do you mean kind of branching scenarios, or do you mean kind of more exploratory environments?
Yeah, at this stage I was thinking about it from the point of view of assessment, where we're actually tracking how students respond to something, because often when we set students tasks and we want to assess that, we either have to decide, do we want everyone to have the same response, and that's the correct, if you like, or the response that will be marked as correct, or whether we're quite happy for them to have different responses, and then the role of assessing them and then working out what's the relative worth of those different responses that they give.
Well, I think that is a real power of game-based assessment, because you can personalize to any extent you want, but you can still have these balanced measures as well. So I suppose ultimately, leveling up, for example, is something that all of the students can be measured against, but particular areas of struggle or error can also be picked up. So you can begin to see, as a tutor, you can actually measure whether somebody really has completely understood a particular issue of citizenship, for example. Have they really understood about the difference between slavery and and how that works in an environment? That's something that you can really start to pick up on, because of how you're actually structuring those kinds of quests or those kinds of dialogue interactions. So the level of sophistication of how you can actually measure quite deep, philosophical even and conceptual learning is much more subtle than you could do at present. I mean, and it's very subjective. When you're marking an essay, as you say, I mean, there's so many different ways that you could respond to that question, and it's quite difficult really to kind of see how they might apply that knowledge. Whereas in this environment, they're understanding the knowledge through applying it. So that link between theory and practice is much narrower, and therefore you can feel much more confident in a way that they really have understood that. And you can actually see that on a person-to-person basis, or you can actually start to look at it across groups as well. And because of the way that we can analyze data, the possibility is massive in terms of accelerated learning, I think. So we should probably get kids to a much higher level of understanding much more quickly. And I think that's, again, that is, the holy grail as well, of course, of learning. How can we accelerate learning?
Yeah, thanks. And actually, that just made me think of another issue then too. Sarah, in terms of capabilities, one of the issues I think we're dealing with at the moment is, especially in higher education, we have the output that we give students when they leave is usually a bit of paper that's like a testament that says, I got X number of marks and a grade of X in this subject across and that adds up across your whole program. And I know there's obviously a big move towards e-portfolios where students can have artifacts of their output and the capabilities they're developing to be able to show other people. But I also think that games would play a very good role at being able to do, and I'll just use the term capability map here, but I think we can get a much richer view of what students are actually capable of doing, because we can track sort of very complex interactions or very complex problems that they're dealing with, but also look at the relative paths that they take when solving those problems, and we can get the relationships between those paths. So I think one of the next things, certainly from my point of view, that I would like to So I know some people are doing this, but I haven't seen it come down to something that a sort of a mainline discipline-based academic could actually use. Is something that would be able to give a visual image of a capability map that defines in a much richer way what it is the student can actually do or participant can actually do.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, it's one of those fields that is very exciting in the sense that, the more you go into it, the more you see the, the possibility of it. And, with assessment, because I've only really been thinking, because I've had to do, this will be the third or fourth talk I've done on e-assessment in the last, say, 4 months. So I've only really been thinking about it recently. But the more you actually start to think about assessment, the more you begin to realize, how exciting actually game-based approaches actually could be in the future, because it isn't just about kind of understanding learning as sets of tasks that can be mapped against measures. It's actually more about, how you can take, as you say, capabilities or conceptual understandings or, much deeper understanding and map that against kind of physical interactions and social interactions, but also against measures and metrics that are much more subtle. And I think it's that layering, and you could, as I say, as you kind of more you think about it, the more you begin to realize how exciting that really is, and how then the line between virtual environments and learning experiences and assessment, that itself will begin to blur more and more. And you'll begin to maybe create tools that will be almost more assessment driven, that can then create, almost automatically create environments. So you could begin to create much more sophisticated understandings of assessment, and kind of look at learning from that angle, which is something which, you could never really have done before because we just didn't have the tools to do it. So I think the next 5 years are going to be extremely interesting. I think we're going to see much, much more complex approaches to assessment come as a result of that. And the fact that you can actually map more closely to people's, to their thinking and to their, physiological reactions. Again, there's so much there we don't know, but if we can start to really understand a bit more about that, we can really design much, much more exciting learning environments. And I think teaching in the future will, and I've written papers around this idea, will be more about choreographing learning experiences than it will be about structuring knowledge in ways that can be assessed. And I think there's a lot more creativity in the future for tutors and mentors. And I think that that's actually a very exciting place to be.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with all that. That's excellent. Were there any other comments that people wanted to make, or any other questions they'd like to put out? Chad?
Yes. Thanks very much for that very extremely interesting talk. The thing about assessment is very interesting. I've got the question I have is around commercial games and those games that are mostly for entertainment. And one of the biggest trends I've seen, or biggest common things, is the reward systems being used and being, people promoting their gamer score and things like that as a really important part of their identity. So the question I had was, have you looked into some of the trends around learning and tutorials and that sort of thing in commercial games, and had a look at some of the models and some of the ways that commercial games do this very effectively, and thought about how that can be used in serious games or for learning?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we borrow a lot from leisure games, and certainly the company we talked about earlier, TrueSim, I mean, they're a division of Blitz Games, and Blitz Games are quite a well-known commercial games company. They've got the 5th best games engine in the world. So kind of that does give you an idea about how close the sectors are together. So most of what we do is based on entertainment game development and those processes. But they are different because what they're trying to achieve is, after all, entertainment and enjoyment. They want people to level up and go through the processes